Brilliant. Right. Well, let's begin then. So, thank you everyone for joining this beta event on the housing crisis and really focusing in on how technology and particularly modern methods of construction can help unlock more around the housing sector. We're joined by some fabulous guests and speakers that have lots of different perspectives on the housing sector, from suppliers to technology providers. And we start off with Mark. Mark, would you like to give an introduction to yourself and Resi?
Yes, thank you very much. I'd love to stand here today and talk about how amazing Resi is and how amazing we have been at solving the UK housing crisis. But despite our best efforts, we are, as a company, are currently failing. And sadly, the fact that I think about only 0.1% of our 5,000 projects have actually used modern methods of construction, and about 20% have used some form of retrofit. It really is below where it should be. And I'm the head of architecture here at Resi. So it's something which weighs pretty heavy on myself. But this is not through lack of trying. And I really believe we are trapped in a construction industry who, quite frankly, is no chance right now of successfully hitting its potential contribution to the UK's net zero target. I really believe that. And it's this construction industry which it's responsible for 40% of the CO2 emissions, which with Jermaine and actually quite sexy. And one of the reasons why we're all here is trying to solve the UK housing crisis. But for Resi, it's not just a housing crisis. It's not just about the number of houses we're trying to build. It's something even greater. It's a built environment crisis for us. And what does a built environment crisis mean to Resi? I'm sure everyone's thinking it's two things. Firstly, Resi's mission is improving homeowners' well-being through the buildings they're living in and extending and renovating. And secondly, it's having a positive impact on the built environment by building better. And I'm sure we're all aware that the UK housing market right now it's so fragmented. And what I mean by this, it's so fragmented for the individuals who are extending and renovating and building for the first time that because of this, it prevents any reasonable green solution being applied quickly and at scale as it should be. And in simpler terms, we basically cannot apply modern methods of construction to a large number of proportion of home builders, renovators, and extenders to really make a difference. And here's our issue with retrofit and MMC home extensions. There are currently 28 million homes that need to be retrofitted by 2050. 28 million is absolutely huge. And there are 500,000 homes that are being extended every year with a small proportion using MMC. And for both of these, there's a lack of customer demand and education, which I'm sure we all know about. And for both of these, there's no effective and ambitious policy driver, again, demonstrated by the government today. And for both of these, the cost per home to test, install, and manufacture. So let me tell you how Resi is trying to engage with this here. So at Resi, we want to defragment the UK housing market by using economies of scale in three ways. Firstly, we want to pool these customers who want to retrofit or extend their building, and in doing so, lowering the financial barriers, lowering their ability to appoint consultants, suppliers, installers for MMC. And we want to do the same with a deep retrofit strategy, a strategy that pulls together financing and suppliers and installers, creating these net zero houses. And again, lowering that entry point for all of these crucial retrofitters. And finally, we want to build these extensions, the walls, the floors, the ceilings, in modular factories, hopefully with some of the people on this panel today. And I guess the unspoken truth is retrofit isn't sexy. And people aren't going to voluntarily start ripping down their Laura Ashley wallpapers unless they're forced to, which they probably aren't. But the key time of this is when people are actually doing retrofit, is when they are extending or renovating. And how Resi wants to drive impact is tying these two streams of thought together.
Right, I think, Mark, we are just starting to lose you ever so slightly. But that was a fantastic introduction. You've already answered question number one, which is what your take on the housing market is. So introducing great themes around fragmentation, sustainability, and a number of other things. Before we get on to those, Nicola, would you like to introduce you and Project Utopia?
Yeah, I'm Nicola Clayton. I have worked in housing now in different guises, from junior housing clerk to head of sales at Utopia, where I am now, over the last 30 years. At Utopia, we are a MMC Category 2 manufacturer, which is a hyper SIP panel, an insulated panel, and we provide the exoskeleton superstructure of a home to anybody that wants to build EPC A-rated homes or homes that exceed the Future Home Standard. So I'll leave it there for now. I've got lots to say, but I'll wait for the questions.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Nicola. Lucas, would you like to introduce yourself and Modulize?
Yeah, for sure. So for me, a lot of what's been already said obviously resonates with me, but so from like my contribution to the panel might be a slightly different, slightly of a bit of an outside perspective, because I'm actually based in Oslo, Norway. But I think a lot of the topics that already came up are kind of the same all over the place, and we look at various countries, and it's not like a problem that is unique to the UK. So I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit as well, and then how that relates back to the UK. But so on Modulize, we are a startup based here in Oslo, Norway. We've been going for a couple of years, and what we're developing is effectively a procurement platform for offsite construction, for various different types of offsite construction as well, connecting generally typically the general contractor with the right types of manufacturers. We're not focused on one specific approach, but rather trying to tie together, especially around more complex projects that use and need different types of elements, different types of materials, potentially even in the same project, and trying to address some of the issues around this massive fragmentation that we see in the market, especially when you look at offsite manufacturers that have been kind of around for a long time, are focused on one type of material, one type of element. And while there's differences across countries, this overall kind of issue of a massively fragmented market and difficulties for both sides of the coin to actually efficiently come together are kind of pretty consistently there. So what we're building is this platform, basically addressing the entire procurement and tendering process, bringing together both the general contractors and the various types of manufacturers on Modulize, so that we can go through an end-to-end tendering process, matching the right kinds of manufacturers to the right kinds of projects. So I'll stop there for now as well, keep it short and sweet. And like Nicola, I'll try and have a lot of opinions as well and share my thoughts as we go.
Fantastic. And I appreciate that, Lucas. And I think we always look for people that have good experience around the procurement cycle. It's almost always the route to MMC and different areas of transformation sits in procurement. So I'm sure you'll be a popular guest for questions. Jeremy, would you like to introduce yourself and the Ibstock Futures business?
Yes, good morning, everyone, and I don't know, good afternoon from depending on where people are. I'm Jeremy Rombaud. I'm the managing director of Ibstock Futures, which is a new division of Ibstock, which at the same time as I'm speaking, we are building as it goes. We started last year. We have already acquired 2 businesses and have invested in a new fully automated brick slip manufacturing factory, all oriented towards the MMC. But the purpose of Futures, if we may say, is to enable the full potential of MMC in the UK through partnerships and working with developers and contractors in developing new building systems, in which we will be leveraging our industrial know-how, as the parent company Ibstock is a 200 years old industrial manufacturer and the biggest manufacturer of bricks in the UK. But so we will leverage that industrial know-how. However, we will also enhance and complement that with partnerships with innovative companies such as those present on this panel. So that's a bit where we are. We are bringing together the industrial and the innovative digital and all enabling technologies to try and address and unleash this full potential of MMC here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And last but not least, Chris, would you like to introduce yourself and Modulus?
Thanks, George, and good afternoon to everyone. So Modulus, our aim is to digitize design and reimagine construction to enable sustainable affordable homes. Our aim is to build a global scalable business, but we are firmly concentrating on the UK and the US at present, but always interested to speak to parties about where they can be. We're very firmly in the new build sector at the moment, and we have a very big launch coming up at UK Reef in May, which is our digital tool. And our first physical product will go on site within the next few weeks at Bristol as well. So the next 12 months is an incredibly important time for us. And again, similar to some of the themes brought up by others, we very much want to aim to collaborate with people, whether it be manufacturers that have product that needs to go on there, people that have good thinking around how to make procurement actually work. And naturally, you know, retrofit is something that is in our target sites down the line, but very much concentrating on the build at the moment. So looking forward to concentrating, looking forward to contributing to the panel discussion. The one thing I would say is that we are a blend of, actually, I have found previously, having been in businesses like Mace, Lendlease and Places for People, it's quite comforting for me to work in a business now where less than half of us are from the real estate. So we're really trying to bring in outside factors from automotive, aerospace, other industries to learn where they've been successful, but also challenge some of their thinking so that they understand the unique characteristics that's in this wonderful industry: fragmentation, bizarre procurement rules, all the usual sort of stuff, and how we can try and overcome that to help deliver.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Chris. So I guess to open the discussion up, it's always easy, I think, to slate the UK housing crisis and focus on all of the bad, negative things that people come up with. And it's pretty clear that we are behind the various build targets, and equally there's a huge retrofitting program. Nicola, for you, where do you see the big opportunities though for the UK housing sector, and where should we be focusing the majority of our attention? Is it new build? Is it retrofit? Is it building regulations? Where do you see some of the biggest opportunity?
It's a tough one. Because there are so many pressures, and you know, I could argue for any of those to be prioritised. As a woman of a certain age with a 21-year-old who at the minute has absolutely he knows he will very unlikely be able to move out for a long time. It's despairing for you, well, for me and my husband, but also for them. You know, what are they working for? Why should they work? You know, they've no realistic chance of owning their own home. And in some, you know, and I'm in Yorkshire, obviously, you know, in some parts of the country, they can't even afford to rent their own home. And that's always been driven by a lack of supply, and that's always been the case. There isn't enough housing. A lot of the housing that we have is poor quality, and there aren't enough options for people, affordable options. So I think fundamentally the housing market now is ripe for change, and I mean across the board, because more and more consumers, the people that rent or buy homes, are able to say, and I've heard feedback from our customers, that new buyers and renters are insisting on energy efficient homes. They're not going to pay thousands of pounds a month for a home that is going to cost them an additional hundreds of pounds a month to heat. So I think it's crucial now that it is becoming more customer led, the need for efficient homes and high quality homes, now that people know that there's an option. And I think the increase in utilities has definitely driven that. And I think if one thing is going to make this industry change, it's consumers. You always hear people complaining about new builds, that, you know, it's on Greenbelt. You never see people campaigning saying, but I don't have anywhere to live. So I think this is sort of that part of the housing cycle, this is our opportunity now to say, no, we want decent homes, we want them to be affordable, we want them to be energy efficient, and we want to be able to live comfortably in our own home.
Perfect. Very interesting answer. Jeremy, how would you tackle that question? What would you add to what Nicola's mentioned?
No, I fully agree with Nicola. And again, having lived and seen other markets, I find the UK market is interesting and very specific in terms of the supply-demand dynamic here. But again, there are some real underlying industry challenges around the ability to produce enough of those missing homes, if you want, every year. And this goes in addition to the capacities in the planning department to prove enough. But then skills is a very big one, which I think we should be discussing a little bit later. I definitely see also, from what Nicola said, a very strong potential, and people like Resi are doing that, in retrofitting and improving the existing stock of houses, as well as, again, addressing a temporary period between somebody owning a house upfront at the age of 21. But again, if we look 30 years back, people were not owning a house at 21. If we look at our parents, they have probably started to own their home at the age of 50. But therefore, there is a period in which people need to be able, young people, professionals need to be able to access quality homes. So the build to rent sector, the affordable housing kind of element into that is something we should definitely be able to address. And again, that can allow for scale through MMC, because adoptions will be much easier than an individual making a choice for his own or her own house.
Brilliant. Fantastic. And Mark, is there anything you would add, particularly from that kind of more retrofitting side, as well as the new build supply?
Yeah, I think there's three things for me. Sometimes it really frustrates me whenever we have these great ideas, but there's like hurdles letting us, or not letting us, like, execute them. And I do think that the entry point for a lot of people is too high, that they can't comprehend the sort of the lifetime cost versus the upfront cost. And I don't know what you think, Nicola, but for me, there's a big piece on, like, education to the general public of these benefits, because they're scared. They're scared of, like, having to pay X amount more now and then not being able to really appreciate that in 2 years' time you get that back. And I think Jeremy's touching a really interesting point there, and I've seen him mention it before about the labor shortages. Again, we've got great ideas and we've got great things in motion, but this, like, really, like, the shortages in the construction labor market really potentially will hinder any sort of growth in these sort of MMC and even the traditional builds to get these houses made. So I think the education, the upfront costs, and the labor market really, actually, thought things would keep me up at night, because we have the great ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Go on, Nicola.
I was just going to say, I'm a bit frustrated with that, because and I will keep saying this, and I'm sorry, but for 30 years I've been working in housing, and those comments around lack of, we're not building enough houses, the quality's poor, fuel poverty were around then, and the same reasons were given then, that, it's planning, there isn't enough land. Well, but what have we done? And I'm not saying I've got the answers. I'm not clever enough to have all the answers, but I just know I'm really frustrated that we haven't solved some of these issues yet. And we're still having the same conversations year on year, and we're still building houses using block and brick. We still have the same planning system that we've always had. And it just really frustrates me. And I'm hoping now that consumers, and we have a generation of younger people that are more willing to stand up and say, this isn't right, this isn't fair, and be more proactive and productive in terms of standing up for what they want. That we will, hopefully now see some change. And the other big factor, obviously, is the carbon reduction targets, which are low. And I really, really hope that they aren't watered down at all, because that is the only thing that is going to change fundamentally the standard of building of homes in this country. It's not going to happen by choice, especially by the big developers, and it's going to take legislation, just like it did to stop us smoking, just like it did for us to wear seatbelts. I am that old.
That's very interesting. And well, from your perspective, Lucas, just out of curiosity, then, how do you see it being based in Oslo, working in international markets? You know, where there are differences between what other international countries are doing and what the UK is facing?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is kind of what I mentioned in the beginning. None of these problems seem unique, right, to one country in particular. So, and one point that I thought was really like a nice way of putting it that Mark mentioned around, like, yeah, we have all these great ideas, right? So I think what I see being important, whether it's the UK, Norway, or any other country, is that, and that's a little bit of a parallel trying to build a company, right? We need to, I think we're at this point with the industry where we just kind of need to just move and do stuff. I think be pragmatic and do anything that will make a difference while keeping kind of the eye on the prize when it comes to big impact, so that we don't end up in this, hey, we have great ideas and we'll see where that gets us kind of stage where, and that's, I think, also one of the reasons why MMC or offsite or however we call it resonates there, because it kind of, I think if we do it right, it lets us address all of these challenges in a big way, but we get to move quickly and make changes and show them physically and move quickly on individual projects as well. So you kind of, if we do this well and we actually tell the right story around it as well, I think, which is important to, because you do need the great ideas and the big ideas. But that's, I think, why this is such an important topic, because it lets us do the big stuff and the small stuff, and it addresses not just labor shortages, not just environmentalism or targets, but all of the above. So that's, I think, one of the reasons that we're so excited about it.
Yeah, brilliant. And so it sounds like, as we've talked about already, some of these problems have been around for quite a long time. Even modern methods of construction as a term has been around for a long time. I mean, arguably some of the technology that we're trying to implement now is not that modern. It's just things that have been around, and there is probably a big education piece for consumers around what it really means, especially on quality. From your side, Chris, where do you think the biggest opportunities are for modern methods of construction? And is it about more of the new build supply? Is it retrofitting? Where do you see the big opportunities?
Well, naturally, as Modulus, we're focused on the new build, but I would just say one thing from previous experience of being the housing association faces people is, obviously, in terms of overall the housing targets that get mentioned, and I'd happily be shot down here, but the private sector has generally been consistent in the numbers that it delivers, and it's the drop off of public sector housing that has really contributed over the last period to the massive shortfall that we see now. Now, what people need to understand with housing associations is a lot of the new build houses that they develop are based on money, the funding that they get borrowed against their existing assets. So the retrofit issue compounds things, because the value of those assets drops and they can't borrow as much money against it. So you have to invest in the retrofit to enable the housing associations to actually do their new build developments. So there's a virtuous circle here that needs to be resolved. And that's why retrofit is so incredibly important for this country to get right, and why it probably needs a sort of regulatory intervention, something along, even just a starting thing of actually having a housing minister that sits at cabinet is consistently in there for a period of time. We've had more housing ministers than we've had prime ministers in the UK, which to some people just sounds bonkers, them knowing how many prime ministers we've had. So we need some stability at those sorts of levels in order to do so. I think once you start getting some of that real systemic sort of structuring things right, other things will start to correct themselves in where they go. I think, as Nicola touched on, consumers will become all important in this, whether they are purchasing properties or whether they are renting properties, in terms of what you need to do and how you need to go about it. And that's what we as an industry need to revert to. I've seen it where I've been involved in projects going around looking at schemes like co-living, and people going, who on earth would want to live in a place this small in comparison to what you could get? Now, of course, it's relevant to what you can afford and it being in the right location. But we also have to remember lifestyles change. I used to have vinyl, and I used to have tapes, and I used to have CDs. So I needed space to store that. You just don't need that sort of stuff now, and the lifestyle changes. So things have to adapt, and we have to keep up with that. And something that we are trying to do is introduce speed at every single stage of the process that we can. Can we change the planning process? We haven't, as Modulus, we don't have a hope of trying to change that planning process. We would like to demonstrate to people how we can make parts of it faster, better informed and more efficient, but it needs to have regulatory change in order to inform how we're going to go about that. And that's really where we need to learn from other countries about how they go about enforcing change. In Ireland, they have taken decisions at a national level to try and take away the elements of, I suppose, inaction that have been happening at a local level. And it's those sorts of things that we will absolutely want to advocate through forums like this, through lobbying in any way we can, that those sorts of changes will then initiate how we as the private sector can respond to the opportunities that will afford.
That is very interesting. And so just coming back to one of your earlier points around the private sector being quite stable with the capacity that they're producing on new build housing, and actually it's the public sector that's perhaps fluctuated more so, particularly against the targets. Would you advocate for then more government intervention in incentivizing both public and private sector to build more? Or how would you go about some of that government support?
Well, it's probably easy to say that you can throw money at stuff and it will make it happen. But I think, across the board, planning is the obvious one to obviously pick on. And I hear what Nicholas says. We have been advocating for change in planning for whatever. But I think, we find now that through speaking to fellow professionals who are more involved in planning on a day-to-day basis, I have never heard the level of frustration that I hear now with the planning processes that they have to go through. And there is something to be welcomed about that. I suppose it is. I'm not saying it's a uniquely British thing, but we do seem to have a far more contentious planning system than practically any other country, and it just seems to be a root of a lot of the problems. Is the ability for us to be able to get through what is needed in any given area in order to meet those challenges, but in a time scale that enables people to invest in the process. The uncertainty and the length is the thing that just discourages people from getting involved in it at all.
Mm. And one of the comments that was made earlier was just, absolutely, Lucas. What would you like to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little maybe non-UK anecdote or kind of an insight, I think, from what we see in Norway, where I think there's like an in-between path when we talk about regulation, the private housing versus public housing, where I think while there are plenty of challenges here in Norway, I think one of the things that works and that has a really positive influence over the market as a whole is that the big state-owned general contractor, who is one of the biggest players in the market, is quite advanced, and they push a lot of requirements to everybody else in the value chain. And because they're so big and they're state-owned, they introduce this kind of market power without relying on regulation necessarily. And so I think that's one of the things that I noticed here that actually have a really positive impact. And you can see that whether that's in terms of higher requirements around consistent data availability, just details on the projects, or anything else related that's kind of touching various parts of the project itself. And they then, for certain types of projects, at least, it's not for everything, without having to just go full out regulatory frameworks, they do get to set the standards in certain ways that are very helpful. So I think that's like a really nice in-between way of actually solving some of these problems. Obviously, it doesn't nearly solve everything, but I think that does help the overall ecosystem here when you look at construction in Norway, just because there's such a big player and they get some of the things right on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before Mark responds as well, if there's any guests that have any questions at all, feel free to ask a question in the chat, and we'll make sure the panelists answer that. Mark, what would you like to contribute?
Thanks. I guess my concern with retrofit currently that it can be perceived as like piecemeal and not taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture. And for me, until you include financing and regulation, like Chris said, and with planning, and even the marketplace for contractors, you really don't have a chance of this real scale. And I just back to Chris, my question to you is like, do you think we're approaching the retrofit discussion ambitiously enough as a country, or do you think there's more we can do?
There's always going to be more we can do. But I think you're right, actually. There is a perception that retrofit is done at a very small level. And I suppose it is done on a very individual level. And actually what people need to understand is that I have seen attempts in the past to sort of try and look at, consistent typologies that you can apply the retrofitting solutions to. And that seems to be the sort of thing that we should be able to more unify behind and get involved in, so that people understand the potential that can be achieved by doing this. And it absolutely has to centre around, the fabric first thing. If you can get that right and absolutely, sort of resolve that issue, most of the other issues can sort of follow on from that. And that's the education. And I have to say, I was guilty of it as possible about, my family complaining about the small extension on the back, which we've been aiming to replace for years. But I'm sort of waiting to try and find the ultimate technology that just does it in the best possible way, when really what I should be doing is just biting the bullet and doing the best that I can at the moment and getting towards that, because I'll see all the benefits of it. So I suppose I need to practice what I preach. But I would love to buy into a much bigger sort of initiative where you could all come together to get the benefits of that scale in order to achieve really, I suppose, transformational outcomes for your individual property, which after all, taking up Nicola's point, for the majority of us will always be the biggest financial outlay we ever make. Yet we seem to give it less, people probably, maybe being a bit horribly stereotypical here, but probably spend less time thinking about some of the stuff they do to their house than they do purchasing a new iPhone. In terms of, other phone brands are obviously available. Buying the phone and comparing and contrasting as to what would you actually do with a house, and giving people the options around that by saying, you now need to understand the benefits you get by doing this, as opposed to just what may be aesthetic. You need to have these performance levels. They are absolutely critically the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeremy, what are you about to add into this?
Yeah, what I find from having looked at the UK market and comparison with other markets is there are some really positive steps that have been made, especially on the policy level, with the government pushing for a share of MMC in projects, or even the example of BOPAS, which was the 2 cycles, 60 years kind of guarantee for insuring, because otherwise you don't get a mortgage on a modular house, etc. There has been certain things, and I'm sure that if we were able to combine the know-how, now the technology advancements which exist today, there is almost like we are ripe in technology versus when modular or whatever it was called then was prefabricated, was in post-wars and 60s, 70s. So there is a very different time today. And therefore, I'm sure that there will be a solution to even addressing a more interactive planning. However, I also see the rise of build to rent in this market, and to go back to people who are more conscious about or more pragmatic and conscious about the energy efficiency and the maintenance of the buildings and elements like that, is also a big driving force versus the design and build era, wherein it was all about cost and what you call value engineering, etc., to reduce by purely driven by the contractors alone sometimes. So that's basically the driving force. But what we really need, actually, if we are putting in the background the housing crisis and we want to bring a pragmatic solution, as Lucas was saying, is the ability to be able to combine the forces, even if we take this group here, so I mean, I can refer back to a recent interview by the CEO of Uber, which is Dara Khosrowshahi. He said one of the biggest failures in Uber's journey was the acquisition of Lime. I don't know if people have seen the Lime bikes, we all ride. Because from a PowerPoint or from a software point of view, it made sense. You know, we are managing cars, so we are managing now cycles, and it's the new way of driving, etc., mobility. But then it was a completely different world, because Uber never managed a car or the maintenance or the change of a tire. And all of a sudden, in those bikes, they had to do a lot of hardware. So what I really want to highlight here is that, yes, there will be some people coming from the software world who are like modulars, who are very driven by, you know, driving efficiency, and they will have a huge value. We would be awful if we were trying to develop a software ourselves, because it would take us 3 years just to spec it, and then it would be irrelevant. But then it has to clearly combine with the physical world or the hardware. Otherwise, you know, we could see the Catera effects and all that. So again, being pragmatic is combining these forces, talking to the right people, so build to rent or people like that who can appreciate the long-term full life cycle value, and then influencing, other elements, or working together on other elements like skills or planning, etc., by making things easier, or, you know, accessing a bigger pool of resources. So that's what I wanted to add. So it's not all gloom. Actually, there's quite a lot that the UK government has already moved on in pushing for that goal of 2025, 2030. I mean, I hope sometimes we speak about 2050, but at least let's focus 2025 and 2030.
No, absolutely. I think every time we get to 2050, we're floating in the skies and doing all sorts of things and living on the moon. So
Hover cars.
Exactly. Housing crisis is solved when you're in 4 different planets. But Nicola, what did you want to add?
Yeah, I've got a couple of points that other people of the panel have picked up. I think it was Chris that talked about education, and I consider myself mainly an educator, because a lot of people I speak to have maybe spoken to 1 or 2 other MMC providers, and so their idea of MMC is whatever information they've gathered before, so they don't know about the full range available. And secondly, as a consumer myself, if someone was to knock on my door from the government and say, you've got to retrofit your house by next year, even the line of work that I do, I could not very easily make a decision on which would be the best for me, because I don't have that knowledge, and there's too much choice, too many options out there. I think Jeremy mentioned about BOPAS and NHBC being sort of good qualifiers for developers to make decisions. But even though we have BOPAS certificates, we have NHBC, we have ISO, we have BDA Agreements, we are on frameworks, we are on DPS services with local authorities and housing associations and national housing bodies, and still people say, have you got any references? How do we know that this system is going to be standing in 60 years' time? Well, you know, nobody knew there was a pandemic coming, but here we are, we all survived. And I think that for me, there's a massive amount of fear in the industry, fear of making decisions, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of, well, there'll be something, I think Chris mentioned this, that there might be, I might see something better next week. You know, it's exactly the same as if you're choosing to buy a new car or choosing to go on holiday, or if I just keep looking, I might find a better deal, I might find a better place. And to me, there's a big element of JFDI, you know, whatever we're talking about, retrofit or MMC, if you do it, it will be easier the next time and it will become cheaper the more you do it. So, and JFDI is just flipping do it, or you can support, you know, substitute the F for whatever word you want. But we've got to stop this constant, oh, there might be something better next month. No, you've got what's in front of you now. Make the decision and get on with it, because failure is better than inaction. For me, that's what I think.
Very interesting. Chris, you were about to add something, and I'd just also be interested to get your take on one of the questions in the chat, which is also about just the shift from permanent to potentially temporary solutions. Actually, can we unlock planning and unlock capacity by building more temporary solutions that maybe are easier to get through planning. But Chris, do you want to add what you would like to say?
Well, actually, sort of Nicola covered it, which was the case of completely just JFDI, which is, the one thing I would say is that there's obviously been attempts to sort of aggregate demand, because obviously that's one thing with offsite construction, if we're picking on that particular part, which often gets cited, which is obviously if there was a big demand piece available, then the various manufacturers can respond to that a lot easier because they can adjust and scale and suit and tailor to suit me. Where one of our constant frustrations is someone going, I want to try, but they want to try it on a very small scale. Whereas we would actually prefer to have a range of people that come together, a range of clients, customers that would actually want to do something on a slightly larger scale, and it be sort of 80% getting to the answers that they want, but what they'll see is the commonality between them. So we get this all the time. We have very unique flat plans. Well, you don't really, because they are all very similar. They're all going to be in and around national described space standards, unless you are doing something radically different, and in which case you'll have the whole planning journey to go through anyway. So it is about this trying to get people to, and as Nicola said, the education piece about understanding that even the smallest variation causes massive issues where you're trying to do the off-site manufacturing piece. So something as simple as, and I remember this from when looking clients, was I had a developer who just said, oh, we never put the outside tap in that place. It's always just around the corner. But to the off-site manufacturer, that's a huge change. It's not just a case of telling the labourer on site, the plumber and the brickwork to work slightly differently on site. It is a huge change if you're changing all of that process, drawings, fabrication, and everything that needs to happen in the factory. So it's about an understanding of that process. To pick up your point about, George, that you said to be asking the chat about meanwhile, or temporary use. I think what really helps here is more time spent in that pre-planning, which we would love to do with customers and clients, about understanding the outcomes that they need. So is it a temporary use on our site? Is it that site is going to be a different use down the line? So is it that something is temporary accommodation now, but ultimately that site's going to be used for permanent accommodation? So is the asset that we're trying to create there something that needs to be moved, or is it something that needs to be reconfigured? And if you get that sort of thinking right early enough, we can always respond to that. And it's actually beholden on us as an industry to challenge people back as well about some of the aspects there, about saying, well, if it's something that needs to be demountable, then that absolutely plays into circularity, reuse, all of those sorts of things. And we can design it accordingly to do that. It's not a case of just we've got a product on the shelf and we can sort of make that work. We can go out and find the right thing. It's not something that Modulus has at the moment, but we can go and find the right material manufacturer to go and work with, or combination. And that might end up being Utopia with Ibstock, for example, in producing something that then uses our process to make the whole thing work together. So that's where we're encouraged to say, if customers come to us with the pain points and challenges they have early enough in the process, we are willing to spend time working with them on them coming together, because we can see the long-term picture of where it needs to be.
Yeah. Just before we come to Mark and Lucas, Jeremy, was there anything you wanted to add on the question about the sort of permanent to temporary solutions?
We're currently working on something quite interesting in that regard, and you have a lot of that, for example, with the NHS, where they need immediate accommodation for staff near the hospitals. So again, how do you create accommodation that can be in a way created for some time and then eventually moved or removed? There is something around the, unfortunately, a huge amount of requirements around the migrant crisis. So again, creating lodging for that. So yes, I believe so that there is an opportunity, and it's easier to do that obviously with modular than to do it with traditional build in those spaces.
Brilliant.
And probably again, to go back to those points, it's much faster and easier to address those planning constraints, and again, all that goes with what we discussed before.
Yeah. So it sounds like actually MMC gives more opportunity, especially in temporary solutions, to do that at pace, and perhaps there is more we can do to explore kind of temporary solutions rather than just permanent capacity as well. Great. Mark, what would you like to add?
Thanks. 2 points. First of all, the whole idea of the education retrofit, Nicola, you're absolutely right. And that fear of the unknown is so interesting. And there was an ONS study done last year where it was like 40% of people didn't want to retrofit because of cost. And I actually don't believe that the public know what the cost is. So they know it. Is it upfront cost or is it lifetime cost? And that education piece is so important. And because the market is so fragmented, there isn't this one platform to really educate at scale en masse, like this really key part. And the second point is I focus a lot on the testing of the fabric and making sure you test before and after. And the after is so key for financing and actually making sure what we've done is correct. And the testing, I think, is a major barrier because of skills gaps and cost as well. So I think being able to test these hundreds of thousands of projects over the next 5-10 years potentially is a major barrier to actually rolling this out as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Lucas, would you like to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up a couple of points. So one from kind of Chris talking about standardization, and then this temporary housing or temporary structures question. So I think when we talk about standardization, I feel like there's 2 types of standardization. If we get both of those right, they just unlock a ton of other things where we talk about, okay, we can standardize the building elements and we can try and make them more repeatable and make sure that improves the unit economics, but also improves reusability, because if every building element looks different, reusability in principle is kind of useless if you can't put the building element somewhere else in the next project, right? If it has a weird shape, what do you do with it? So I think that's one. But then the other part of the second type of standardization that I think is at least similarly important is around the underlying information, right? Because we need the documentation, we need the data, we need all of these things also to be consistent and standardized, because that is also important for us to then drive things like reusability. Because if we have the element that's perfectly shaped and fits there, but we don't know what's in it, and we don't have the documentation and the information in a reusable format, then that creates the barrier. So I think that's, if we get those 2 things right, I think we move to a really interesting place where really cool things can start to happen. And one of the things that's, I think, a bit further out there, but just conceptually makes a ton of sense to me. Again, if we get those 2 right, and then we talk about temporary structures, it just, you can start to envision an arrangement or a way of building that isn't necessarily conceived, hey, we built something temporary versus something permanent, but we actually get to decide over time whether or not this should be more or less temporary, right? Because requirements and needs change over time. And if you can actually more easily disassemble things, you can build it as something that can stand for 60 years, can stand for 100 years. But if requirements for this piece of land changes in 30 years or even in 10 years, it's not so prohibitively expensive and environmentally damaging to make changes, because you have these standards in place, and you can start to reuse on a per element basis, and changing requirements aren't this horrible thing anymore. So you actually get to decide over time how temporary something should be without the negative impact there. So I think there's some like really cool opportunities, but we're quite far away from actually capitalizing on those, right? And I think those gets back to us getting better at these 2 types of standardization.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I guess one of the key themes across everyone, and Lucas, something you said right at the beginning of the discussion around having a principal contractor in Norway who's state-owned and able to actually control a lot of the demand, is this idea around actually creating scalability through the demand. And I think there are certain things the UK government are doing to perhaps defragment the marketplace. I mean, if anyone is a buy-to-let landlord, that no longer looks like an interesting thing to do in the slightest. But it does create a lot of opportunity for build to rent and institutional investment coming in at broader scale, which then feeds through the supply chain. Jeremy, you touched around something on kind of skills and how the labour force needs to perhaps adapt a bit more for us to embrace MMC a little bit more. So, I mean, I'm sure we can talk around the regulatory conditions that need to happen to create more aggregated demand for a lot longer. But you know, if we're able to get to a situation where we can drive MMC quicker, what are the barriers, and then what does the labour force need to look like in order to really embrace that demand?
I think it's first of all, I think it's obvious for probably everyone on this call and I guess quite a few, but not everyone, that it's a shift of the nature of labor. We're not anymore into construction, but we are also tapping into the manufacturing workforce, which again is an opportunity in itself because it opens a lot more of access if we compare with really the labor force willing to enter purely into a construction segment. It also is an opportunity by lowering the entry barriers in terms of people who can work in a factory versus people who can work in a job site. I include in that diversity. So the need is a crucial need. I mean, at the moment, what we are saying is that we need approximately 137,000 new workers between now and 2030 every year to be able to replace the 34,000 that are leaving, plus the new ones that need to come to manage the demand. So it is absolutely a significant one. And then we can add to that the retrofit, we can add to that the recladding of towers, etc. So we are saying between now and 2030, the UK needs approximately 1 million workers in the construction industry as it stands now. So of course, the model of Resi is very interesting here because it's almost like a marketplace to be able to validate and get the right workforce and lower a bit of those fears of the individual homeowners trying to renovate or extend their houses. So that's a very powerful thing in managing the existing force. But once again, there'll have to be training and investment in developing the new force, which is what companies have done in the past when they were training drywall installers in mass or they were training bricklayers in mass. Now we have to be able to attract and train a large force of manufacturing workers as well into this industry. But that's, again, something that can be done with the private and public together. But again, this is an opportunity at the same time as one of the big challenges I would see, and therefore best using and the skills available through platforms such as Resi or other ways is absolutely crucial.
Brilliant. We've got a couple of
I'm sorry, but again, modular in itself is a lower consumer of workforce in some. So, for example, we're doing every day now panels going up in high-rise towers, etc. The amount of workforce you need on site is significantly reduced. I think they say more than 40% or 50% less than, and I think it's even more when it comes to those kind of applications. Again, that's clearly a solution as well, the MMC behind that.
Absolutely. So really embracing more of a manufacturing workforce. We'll come to Mark first and then Chris. Mark, what's your take on the labour force?
Yeah, thank you. And just, I guess on Jeremy's point, he's absolutely right. We have this platform, which is really great of like capturing this large market. But Lucas's point on standardization actually helps us even further because I guess modular construction and extensions, it's super hard because you can't really lift like a full extension over a house. And that's one of the major limitations. And we hold our hands up. We're like, how do we address this? And the standardization of smaller details, junctions, walls, roofs, is a much quicker entry point for us. And fantastic if we can build walls in an Ibstock factory and get them to site and do that at scale across multiple projects. That's why we're excited. So it is like our first step is having the platform, but now we need to sort of adapt and use these more standardized approaches to construction at scale to really sort of like drive the benefits of this here. And then in doing so, like Jeremy says, educate our workforce, educate the builders on our platform to do this here, to not for one individual, but for 5,000, 10,000 across the UK.
Yeah, very interesting. So the idea that actually, off-site construction and modular is always thought about as a sort of full unit, but actually we could break that down and it can still be extremely scalable in much smaller units. Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly interesting. Coming to you, Chris.
It's picking up on
yes,
picking up on a couple of points, sort of Jeremy and then also Mark. I mean, there are undoubtedly the labour numbers that need to come back in, sort of labour and managerial, and actually a massive backbone of the industry today has obviously been those people that learned their skills and their experience on the tools and then graduated into management, so had that fundamental understanding of, particularly one of the things Mark touched on there is not necessarily the tools themselves, but the interfaces as to how different componentry and systems work seamlessly to create the performance that we need. And that is always one of the biggest issues of looking at any of these sorts of parts, is the fundamental different dynamics that come when you combine these things together. You make one slight change on something to improve, let's say, the acoustics, and it has knock-on effects in terms of fire, environmental performance, inside and out, etc. So, and then purely just exactly how does that get installed? So you're always juggling these things, and that is why it takes so long to bring something together. Now, the point that I really want to make on the back of that is, yes, on the projections and the way they are, we need that labour, but actually that's partly based on the fact that we have such a still, the basis of the industry is still very artisanal, based on old-fashioned methods of things such as bricks, carpentry, etc. And actually what needs to be done is actually a better embracing of things. And I'll just use the example that's in front of us, is something like the Utopia panels. If you were building houses out of panels like that, you need less of a labour force in order to create that part of the equation. If you were then cladding it in a way which wasn't bricklaying, again, you've probably reduced the amount of labour that you need to be able to do this. And that's what, as an industry, we need to get together more in order to promote and that people understand. We then cut down to the point that Nicola touched on earlier, which is people going, that's fine, but BBA, how long has it been up, and all these sorts of things. And that's the bits as an industry that we need to get over. There are various initiatives that are going on at the moment, for example, to try and help things like timber building under 18 metres, where they've had to go using engineered timber, where they've had to go and get the insurers and the warranties, and knowing that unless they have them signed off and agreed to it, you're just not going to get any traction. And it's those sorts of things that clients really need to investigate and get on board with, to fundamentally understand there are alternatives to doing trad where you will see better outcomes. And unfortunate as it is in the circumstances in which it came about, a massive benefit that's come out of the Hackett report on the building safety bill is clients having to be certain of exactly what is going into. They always were, but now that they know that they can be criminally liable for decisions made during that process, if it's proven down the line, means that they absolutely have to be clear about how it's being designed, who made decisions when, and what's gone into it. And that massively plays into the manufacturing side of things and fundamentally understanding how these systems go together. Now, that goes hand in hand with, if you do it in a more effective way, you need less of a labour force to do so, or you can focus the labour force to really where it can be more productive, notwithstanding that we still need substantial numbers to come into here to replace the baby boom generation.
Brought in an awful lot of points there. Just out of curiosity, that the building regulations, before we come to you, Nicola, the building regulations creating more responsibility on the developers and what's going into the building. Do you think that acts as a kind of catalyst for innovation, or actually the opposite?
As a catalyst for innovation, I'm not sure I can answer that one yes or no, because I think we're only going to see. What I hope it does is actually encourages people, and there is a wide variety of people out there that have been promoting stuff that as a byproduct, they have better information about what they are actually producing. And you rely on, the original equipment manufacturers and their testing and everything that's in there. That's the certainty that you need. I think to pick up an apology, I can't remember who made the point earlier about, maybe it was Lucas, about underlying information. That's absolutely key as well, about having that data so you fundamentally understand what's involved in it. That the fixings that have gone between the framing, the boarding and the insulation, it is that particular fixing. It is not a cheap imitation fixing, which has been fixed in a way which is a slightly different depth, which has compromised the fire boundary, the fire detail that's there, and has possibly fundamentally affected some of the thermal efficiency as well. So it's absolutely about the data that you can interrogate there, so that you know what you're getting. So where I would hope that is that people spend more time researching those pieces to fundamentally understand where they were. That in time may breed the fact that people can spend more time on R&D and innovation because they know that the customers are receptive to what they're producing.
Yeah, it would be certainly interesting to see how it lands. I'm nervous that people end up just using the same solutions that they've been comfortable with and haven't seen any backlash for a number of years, rather than genuinely looking for the more innovative things that are really going to change the hope. But we live in optimism. Nicola, what are you going to say?
Oh, this is becoming a therapy session for me, guys. I'm really sorry. First of all, we've talked a lot about MMC and a lot about modular. And as Chris has done a fabulous sales job for me, Etopia is a panelised system. So Etopia, we have built homes, offices in people's gardens, or gyms if you're, so inclined. So our panelised system can be used for everything, because it basically replaces block and brick, which means it is flexible. So, you can still have your outdoor tap where you want it. You can still move it on the day of your putting in your plumbing to, to have the tap on the side instead of the front. So I think it is key to remember that not all MMC is the rectangles or the boxes that are delivered to site. I think you asked a question around the issues around Grenfell in particular. Is that providing sort of a greater drive for innovation? I don't think it is. It's giving people more reasons not to use something different for the exact reasons that you said, George, because as soon as they realise that they are liable, anything that is a risk is just discounted. And this is the issue that we have. Our panels have PU foam, which is not a material you'd want to stand over when it was on fire. But our system has been designed so that PU foam is safe. And we have recently passed a fire test and it got to 99 minutes and, nothing had happened. And they stopped it because they'd booked the next test, and we wanted them to continue until it actually went up in flames, and they said no. So we can prove that our system might have something in it which is not great in a fire, but we can prove that our system manages that and it performs better than any other material on the market. But that's not good enough for people. But it's so incredibly frustrating that people drive around in cars with a petrol tank in. You're driving around sitting on a bomb, but that's acceptable because it's in a car and cars are safe. But you say you've got PU foam in a house, it's like we can't have it. It's like, but we've spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on tests, and we can prove to you that it's safe. Don't care. We don't have anything with PU foam in. And it's, well, what are you going to build energy efficient homes with? Because frankly, you're going to struggle. And yes, of course, we're looking at alternatives. Is it perfect? No, it isn't. But it's a lot better than block and brick for so many reasons. And it's about having trusting in the data and saying, not making carte blanche decisions like the GLA, no walls with anything that can burn in them. So what are they building out of? you know, everything that we possess, you know, iPhones can blow up. Other phones are available, you know, and start a fire. The vape machines can do that. Hair straighteners left plugged in. Everything's a danger. It's about mitigating that danger and making sure that it's within those limits. And we have done that. And I just wish I had £1 for every time someone said to me, "Oh, we are the most risk-averse company you've ever dealt with." And I wish instead that people said, "Nicola, we're up for this. Let's go for it. We really want to make a change. We want to improve, you know, quality of life for people," which is what we can do. And sorry, one last point, because I know I'm ranting now, is that when we said, you know, we're fragmented and there isn't doing enough to sort of combine the demand, there is, you know, the government has said that 25% of all their strategic partners' development of affordable homes should be MMC. And I think I worked it out once, and I'm not great at maths, that worked out to about £2 billion worth of the Affordable Homes Fund. And do you know what's happening? They're using all the money on building the traditional built homes first because it's easier. And none of them are going to get anywhere near their MMC targets because they've done the easy stuff first. And it's not a criticism, it's a way of life. You know, as humans, that's what we do. But we've got to change our mindset. And what we do is we work collaboratively. We support people to make that transition easier, so it's not as overfacing and difficult to accept. You know, it's about, you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And that's what we have to do. We have to tackle these problems one bite at a time. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. I enjoyed the analogy at the end. We'll let your blood pressure come back down now. Lucas, and then Mark, and then we'll come around to final remarks.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to this, like, which I think is a really interesting discussion around, okay, is it panelized systems? Is it modular? Is it this material, that material? Where I think, and that's also a little bit from our experience of now looking at quite a few different types of projects, and then even if you go residential, commercial, maybe even infrastructure, if you look at the whole breadth, I think for us to have the impact that we talk about being needed is kind of this all of the above, right? We need all kinds of materials. We need modular, we need panelized, we need walls, flooring, roofing. And so I think the way that we look at it is that we can take any project, right? And we should assume that there's some optimal distribution of work that you do on site versus off site. And in some cases, maybe the whole thing should be off site. And in other cases, you only want exterior walls. In the next case, you want modules. And so I think the journey that we would like to be on, and I think that we should generally be on, is that based on an assumption that today that optimal distribution, we're very, very far away from it, and it's massively biased towards doing stuff on site because that's what we know and we've kind of traditionally done more of, and just find the right ways of getting to the optimal distribution. I don't think it's about this is the best system or it should all be offsite, but rather finding that best case distribution across all of the different ways in which we can build. And that's, I think, what will ultimately take us to that place. And it's even, I think, going to look different from one geography to the next. So we've talked about timber as well. Obviously, we're here in the Nordics, there's a lot more use of timber compared to, say, light steel frames. And that probably makes sense, right? But I think that's really where we ultimately need to get to, that because it's so multifactorial, we need to take all of these things into account in some shape or form, and then get to that right distribution. And that will depend on what kind of project it is, where you sit, and what does your supply chain look like. And I guess that is part of the challenge, right? That it is multiple things that have to be taken into account. But I think that's where we need to get to at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And Mark, finally from you.
Just very quickly on Nicola's point, I do think the education, we talk about education, for me it goes past the homeowners and the builders. It's actually like the policymakers and the decision makers too. I know we've often struggled with that sort of education piece with local government, Ministry of Local Government and planners and building regulations, and just want to know, have you had any discussions with these decision makers? And if not, how would you approach that? How would you approach that discussion specifically with your product?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, they won't allow me anywhere near the government.
Maybe that's the problem.
I know that Utopia has, at a high level, been involved in those conversations. We actually did have a housing minister, Lucy Fraser, come to open our site where I am now at Wilburton, and I did rant at her to the point where, they did start to hold me back a little bit, but she was engaged in the conversation and she did genuinely seem engaged. And I thought, oh, it's great. I've made a connection. She gets it. And then 2 weeks later, poof, she's gone to Culture Secretary, I think. So I think, Chris has already made the point that the reason that there hasn't been a lot of change in the recent years is because there's nobody at that top level been there to oversee that change and make those key decisions. But as I said, I am determined now to, you do get to a certain age, guys, and you look back and you think, what have I done? And yeah, I've got a nice house, got a nice car, I've got 2 great kids. I've been married for 25 years. But in terms of my job, I've enjoyed it and I've made some great friends. And I have, made some, I have got a legacy that I can say I built that. But in terms of the fundamental issues, they have not changed. And that's not just through my time, it's through the time before that. And that cannot be right. That cannot be right. And we haven't even touched on developers, which I've got a whole list, but I'll have to save that rant for another day. But no, I would love to be part of that discussion. And, I'm on a mission. So if anybody has any phone numbers for the Prime Minister or the new Housing Secretary, hook me up and I will rant at them.
Fair enough. Now we know why there's so many housing ministers. We get no Nicholas. Brilliant. Well, look, we've covered a huge amount of ground today. And so, in summary, I think it sounds as though lots more can be done at a government level, but also for those towards the top end of supply chains to potentially support the aggregation of demand. But at the same time, MMC just provides so much opportunity, and any provider that's really looking to innovate and provide perhaps full modular systems, but also the breakdown of those into more scalable solutions is things that we can be materially doing to really help solve some of the challenges in the housing sector. And that naturally then feeds through the labour force, where we're perhaps looking at more manufacturing talent that can also help drive some of that change. We'll do a quick sweep of everyone in case there's any final remarks that anyone wants to make. But Mark, if we start with you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed today. It's great having these like minds here, and I think we're all fighting for the same cause. And I said it before, with the right companies coming together, I really do believe we can lower the entry point at scale and make this more affordable, and just shift the needle on the conversation and the actual practical solutions of MMC and retrofit across the country. So yeah, very, very exciting for the next part of this conversation with this group, publicly and privately. And thanks for hosting, George.
Brilliant, thank you. Chris, any final remarks from yourself?
It was similarly a very enjoyable debate, and it's great to have a mix of people as well, rather than it just being, say, like example, like off-site volumetric sort of forum. So having the different views, which engenders the different sort of discussion points. The one thing I would say is that, and whatever the catalyst for this were, but a lot of people always seem to reference the McKinsey report and modernise or die, those sorts of things that crystallise the view. I think the technology offers that are out there, whether they are in the sector at the moment or whether they are outside the sector, and you can see what's being done in different fields, they are there to be able to disrupt, innovate, visualize. And whether it's actually coming from outside sources or whether it's people like, for example, Ibstock Ventures, where they're sort of using their knowledge to help say this is what can be done from inside the sector, there is the ability to change. The thing that really holds us all back, and we can talk about planning, housing ministers or whatever, is commercial attitudes and behaviours. And the commercial attitudes are just not fit for purpose. It is still, all the risks are done for design and dump, all of those sorts of things that do not encourage different ways of trying to approach it. And I do mean different ways, I don't mean wrong or right ways. And to pick up one of Lucas's point, you know, and what they're doing on the procurement thing is great in terms of trying to change the way those things happen. You know, it is choosing the right thing. You know, our system is not going to be right for every solution, but we would work with the client to try then find the right way to do something, as long as we've got the time to do it. And but we would always want to try and make sure that every part of the chain gets rewarded in the right way and is treated in the right way. And that's really the overriding tenet: is commercial attitudes have got to change. You know, contractors beating up trade contractors in time-old fashion, where risk is allocated. You know, those are the things that really stifle this industry changing more.
Couldn't agree more. More collaboration, less cynicism. Jeremy, any final remarks from yourself?
No, first of all, I mean, really thanks for organizing this, and I really enjoyed it. I think what unites us here today is that we're trying to see how we can help the housing crisis, and whether it is for Nicolas' 21-year-old son, or for people who are trying to find a way to renovate their homes with less fear or stress. I kind of really think that what Lucas said is right. You know, we have to have a pragmatic approach. We can't change the world, but what can we do, which is our bit towards that change? And I've known or met some of the other person in this group, and I haven't met Etopia yet, so I'm looking forward to have a nice chat with Nicola offline. But I really, really believe, even to what Chris just said now, you know, the commercial attitude and all. And at our level, we have people like Poplar Haka or Hill Group, and people who are saying, you know, we really want, and they are from the developer and customers and the build to rent guys. They say all these things that we are seeing as barriers. They are saying we want to do it. So how do we join our forces on this, where we can bring the right commercial attitude at the table, where we can bring the right solutions, panelized, you know, volumetric and all that, the right industrial and software knowledge together, and let's make it happen. Let's find one or two use cases. So it's just an open invitation to connect, but to really find one or two real cases. And as somebody rightly said, you do one or two, then others follow, you know, so let's make those one or two. It will already be a good step into this transformation. So really looking forward to continuing this offline.
Fantastic. And just coming back to the other then, so Nicola, Lucas, any final remarks from either of you?
Yeah, maybe for me, just to kind of follow on from Jeremy's point around people actually asking for these things in some shape or form, at least, where we kind of get the same sense. And the way that we've kind of approached initially starting Modulize, we were talking to stakeholders across the value chain, right? So we weren't initially, okay, we need, like, this is the kind of person we need to talk to. And what was pretty striking, that I think we're at least, it seems like we're in a position where there is relatively broad acknowledgement of this, like this MMC offsite construction thing that should probably be more of a thing. So I think we have at least a really cool opportunity to move from the what to more of the how, and just going back to all of the previous points, just get moving, right? And use that moment where I think that can be one of the positive impacts of all of the kind of negative pressures impacting the industry. So the fact that we have environmental requirements, rising interest rates, labor shortages, everything happening at the same time. I mean, if that's not a catalyst for change, then I think we might be in real trouble. So I think it's a really, really cool moment to just get on and move to the how and stop talking about the what we should be doing.
Yeah, perfect. Nicola?
I think I've said enough, but I have really enjoyed it, guys, and I'll definitely be picking up on conversations with all of you. I've heard Chris, I think we've had conversations with Etopia a while ago and we've never been able to pick up. So no, I've really enjoyed it. I've got a new sense of well-being that we are going to make a change now, that now's the time to make it happen. So thanks for reigniting me, guys.
Yes.
Perfect. Mark, you've got the final words.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, like, we have an opportunity here, and with Resi we know we do as well, and it's like driving impact, which will actually impact customers' lives, and making the individual the center point, not thinking about like these certificates or these sort of figures. Is like, how do we impact as many people as possible? And I think this group really has that opportunity, which is really, really exciting. So yeah, thank you for organizing the game.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for being panelists and what's been an incredibly lively debate. And thank you for all of the attendees. Aidan will be following up with a very short survey, which we do appreciate if you fill out. But hope you have a fantastic week and continue solving the UK housing crisis. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Okay,
George.
thank you.
Thanks, Aidan.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.